All right, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to talk about inverse functions. In this section you're going to learn the definition of an inverse function and an inverse relation. We're going to talk about how to determine inverse relation given a set of ordered pairs or given an equation. And then we're going to talk about how to determine if a function has an inverse using the horizontal line test. So when we talk about functions, functions usually take some input, which is x, and gives us an output called y. An inverse function just does the opposite. It takes the output and gives back the input. So if you're given a set of ordered pairs, the inverse relation between the two can be found by just interchanging x and y for each point. And if we're given an equation, the same thing still works. So for example, if we want to find the inverse of this relation, and what we have is h equals the set of points 7 and 8, negative 2 of 1, 3 and negative 4, and then 12 and 15. If we want to find the inverse of this relation, we write that as h with a little minus 1. That's not an exponent. That little minus 1 is just saying it's the inverse. The inverse of that set, all we're going to do is switch x and y around. So the points 7 and 8 becomes 8 and 7. Negative 2 and 1 becomes 1 and negative 2. 3 and negative 4 becomes negative 4 and 3. And then 15 and 12 becomes 12. 12 and 15 becomes 15 and 12. And this is the inverse relation. All we have to do is just switch x and y. Now if we're given an equation, we just have to do the same thing. If we want to find the equation of this inverse relation, x cubed y equals negative 5, literally all we want to do is switch x and y. Everything else stays the same. And so the inverse of this relation would just be y cubed times x equals negative 5. Don't try to do more on these problems than what you're asked to do. Just switch x and y. So not every function is going to have an inverse that's associated with it. To determine if a function has an inverse, we have to determine if it's known as what's called a one-to-one function. A one-to-one function simply means that every x value gives you a unique y value. So each different x value gives you a different y value. No y values are repeated. So if a function is one-to-one, then it has an inverse. Likewise, if it has an inverse, then it's one-to-one. If we know one of the things, we know the other one. So to determine if a given function is one-to-one, we use what's called the horizontal line test. The horizontal line test, a lot like the vertical line test, just says that if you draw a horizontal line anywhere on the graph, and it goes through more than one point, then it's not one-to-one. Okay? If we draw a horizontal line and it goes through more than one point, then that means that y value is repeating, and we can't have any repeated y values. And so let's try this. We want to use the horizontal line test to determine if this graph is one-to-one, or if this function is one-to-one. So all we're going to do is just draw a horizontal line. And if the horizontal line goes through more than one point, which it does here, goes through 3 points, then the function's not one-to-one. Which means this function would not have an inverse. We try another one. If we draw a horizontal line anywhere here, it's only going to go through one point on the function. And so this one is one-to-one. And this function would have an inverse. Now, this part of this graph may look horizontal, but it's not. And we'll talk about that more later in the next section. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to find the inverse of a relation, given a set of ordered pairs or given an equation. And you should be able to use the horizontal line test to determine if a function is one-to-one.